Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Afrikanists Assemble. This month, we asked our contributors this question. Let's pretend that Shakespeare is suddenly cancelled and stricken from the literary canon and school curricula all over the world. You have the opportunity to replace him with an African playwright or author. Whom would you choose to fill the void, and why? Let's hear what they had to say.
I will be careful not to fall prey of binary thoughts. I think we could also try to imagine a world where Shakespeare is not silenced, both in his time and space, but a world where we acknowledge that other literary manifestations coexist and perhaps interact with our beloved Shakespeare. Also, it is important to re-examine the idea of canonization. What does a canon or canonization imply? Within Yoruba literary imagination, for example, who is eligible to be a canon and who confers canonization? Adesanmi Pius remind us that in the Yoruba context, the crowd is the owner of culture. That is, Yoruba literary texts are collectively produced, performed, experienced, and preserved, which makes it problematic to find a canonized individual in certain time as a replacement for Shakespeare. However, a literary enthusiast that is interested in interacting with multiple tropes and imagination, Soyinka, Ngugi, and Aidoo are brilliant authors of colonial African narratives, while the likes of Fagunwa and Okri provides good read for magical realism.
If we were to replace Shakespeare with another writer in the canon and in the curricula, I think Ngugi Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer, would be a better replacement. Ngugi strikes me as an author whose works offer a confrontation with the evils of colonialism and imperialism. Since it is safe to say that Shakespeare's works such as Tempest have encouraged colonization of the other, Ngugi's works offer a counter-narrative. Think of works such as I Will Marry When I Want, Trial of Dedan Kimathi, and Devil on the Cross. In them, the world benefits from the spices of ideas that foreground the intellect of the downtrodden, the peasants, in their struggle to free themselves from their historical, political, cultural, social, and other challenges. I think Ngugi will fit into the position occupied by Shakespeare previously better because he is not just a playwright. Ngugi is a novelist, an essayist, a memoirist, and an autobiographical writer. These genre varieties, coupled with his commitment to the development of literary works in native languages, made him an important writer for the world to study and appreciate. Ngugi Thiong'o has been writing for over a half century, and in his works, the crisis of modernity, the operations of power in a techno world, and the entanglements of ideas and philosophies manifest. If Shakespeare was of the English, I think Ngugi is of the world. If in Shakespeare we have been studying the English values alive, in Ngugi will be studying planetary values in all its vastness.
As an English language teacher, I have always advocated, as in always, that we do not prescribe Shakespeare to children in South Africa. It is wrong on so many levels. So, if I were the chief of English, I would definitely choose something else. I think I would probably, for South African purposes, go with Ethel Fugard, mainly because of the range of his work. You could actually prescribe something new every 3 years, and it would take a while to run out of options. But of course, I would also be able to choose from the plays by John Carney. If I had to choose something from Africa, from beyond our borders, I would probably choose Wole Soyinka. I remember teaching his play The Lion and the Jewel, and seeing the students' enjoyment is actually part of the reward of teaching these kinds of dramas. I just think that it is far more relevant to our learners' lives, and it is written in accessible language. It's not the language of the 17th century. And I just think that it makes so much more sense. People always say that Shakespeare touches on universal themes that are still relevant today. But of course, all plays do that. All plays have a universal element in them. Issues of ambition, jealousy, love, humility, or passion. Any of those themes are covered in basically all plays, or at least all good plays. So there are really so many things to choose from. But yes, please, can we just get rid of Shakespeare?
I would choose Ata Aidoo simply because of her breathtaking detail to the realities of the worlds within she lives, so Ghana and Africa, and especially her attention to women's lives and realities, where in her stories women are always the central figures, always the heroines. More than simply tackling issues of identity and womanhood and sex, family relationships, society's burdens and stigmas on women, Ata Aidoo's writing style and approach is also quite spectacular. So whether she's writing a play or a novel or a short story that she's crafting. And also herself as an activist, both as a feminist and a Pan-Africanist, it means that her stories portray both reality and utopia. There's a freedom that she carries in her stories that allow us, the readers, to imagine multiple worlds and very complex worlds that we do inhabit, but also worlds that we could inhabit. So in a sense, she truly shows us who we are and also who we could be.
If Shakespeare is stricken and cancelled in the curricula all over the world, and an African playwright is needed as a replacement, given an opportunity, I would suggest Wole Soyinka as a replacement. Reasons are, first, Wole Soyinka, like Shakespeare, uses classical antiquity to his advantage. For example, in his play, Death and the King's Horseman, Soyinka writes a play which is deeply rooted in Yoruba rituals and tradition. Also, the play is based on a true life event that happened in Oyo State, Nigeria in 1946, where the colonial masters tried to hold down an event of burying the horseman alongside the king. They tried to stop the event because they termed it barbaric. Secondly, Soyinka, like Shakespeare, infuses poetry in his writings. His language can be termed to be abstract where necessary and concrete where necessary. Thirdly, Soyinka has the capacity to universalize the local and to localize the universal through his themes. For example, in his play, The Lion and the Jewel, we see a clash of culture between the tradition and modernity. We also see gender. This clash of cultures spans all over the world. With these few reasons, Soyinka can be a replacement of Shakespeare in Africa.
Wahona Chilaji su Shakespeare Amulun, ban bindikato Afrik Mojel Plasam, Aksamahar Thomas Fay. Wow! Ban bindikato Senegalais Mogena Yeme. Timbiru Poesie, Menul Fate Leopold Senghor ak Birago Diop. Bindikato Senegalais Chilaku Français Lanyu. Wante, Timbiru Dine, Amna Sheikh Amadou Bamba, Demom Binduna Chi Wolof ak Arab. Timbiru Hamham, Sheikh Anta Diop, bind na téere yu yéeme. Tuta sek dafa am xam-xam ci mbiru théâtre. Ci mbiru téere yi am na Boubacar Boris Diop, Fatou Diom, Mariama Ba ak ñeneen. Menul fàtte woykat yi. Ci misaali John Seck, Youssou Ndour, Har Mbaye ak ñeneen. Te Mbaye Dièye Faye dafa am xam-xam ci mbiru kebetu. Wante pour man, Ousmane Sembène manager place u Shakespeare. Téere ak film yu Ousmane Sembène am na doole trop. Téere ak film yu Ousmane Sembène wax nañu ci jamonoy bi weesu ak jamonoy bi di ñëw.
Wrong challenge from the start, because if you're in my world, then you do not have to imagine what I'm being asked to imagine. We had a literature revolution at the University of Nairobi in the late 1960s. It was the only university at the time. The story is told by Ngugi or Thiong'o in Decolonizing the Mind. I think that is the last chapter, The Quest for Relevance. And in that story, of course, Ngugi is one of the protagonists. It is a story that has been contested in the details and so on. But something happened there, and it happened at the time of Africanization and all these things. And Shakespeare ceased to be central to our curricula. Now, I was born in 1969, so it's difficult for me to imagine anything that happened before I was born. I can, of course, read about it, but that's a long time ago. So we have other playwrights, and I want to simplify because of the time constraints that we have here. We introduce students to drama, and I'm talking drama in this narrow sense, even though I can see that the challenge was asking for any writer that is impressive. So we introduce them to drama by teaching them how to read for theme, and then after that we get into how drama works as genre and the different subgenres, if you can call it that, tragedy, comedy, all that stuff. But the concentration always is you start from Africa going out. And even in those definitions of tragedy and so on, we use ancient Greek plays, for example, instead of Shakespeare. Now, if one was asking me personally, who are my favorite playwrights, I would start by having some disclaimer that I don't consider myself an expert in this kinds of things, in plays and so on. And then I would say that I have enjoyed some Soyinka, and I've been totally frustrated by some Soyinka. And I guess that means that he's the one African playwright that I engage with. He can frustrate me deeply, he can excite me.
Do we need to remove Shakespeare from the curriculum? Well, I've never taught Shakespeare, but African language literature, and so I often ask myself the question how to teach and which books to read and to teach. Well, certainly students should know the African classics, including the important authors of the independence generation, writing in English, French, and preferably also Portuguese, like Soyinka, Achebe, Ngugi, Sembène Ousmane, and probably also the less-known Mozambican Ungulani Bakakosa. They have become truly canonic authors in the context of African literature as well. This means they are important references and iconic intellectuals who have inspired other writers coming after them. So to understand African literature, one basically needs to read them and many more, and still too few people do. But they have also become canonic. Well, they are, in a sense, the Shakespeare of Africa. So there is for me often the question how to expand our view. In the context of African studies departments, they are the ones who have been taught, and this is a pretty restricted range of text and verbal creativity. And the few authors who have been added, wonderful authors, Chimamanda Adichie, Taye Selassie or Ala Mabanku, they help a bit, but it's still a very restricted range. Where are the authors writing in African languages apart from Ngugi, who is a class in its own right? Where is the Tanzanian pioneer writer Shaban Robert, equally important for Swahili literature like Amos Totola for Nigerian prose? Fagunwa, the early Yoruba writer, whose Forest of 1,000 Demons is so often forgotten since Nigerian prose writing starts with Amos Totola. Well, and beyond the classics, have you heard of Zainab al-Bahroun, the young Zanzibari novelist who just won the Mabati Cornell Prize of African Literature? Or Ustad Mahmoud Mao, composing poetry on the island of Lamu? Well, and these are mostly novel writers. In fact, what about the poets and what about the oral performers, the griots, the jelly in West Africa or the mbongo in South Africa? I think some of the most superb African verbal creativity can be found in praise poetry traditions, the Yoruba Oriki, the South African Izibongo, the epic traditions of the Great Lakes, like the Nyanga Bards, for instance. And here often the authors are unknown and authorship is not even important since the text or the recitation is not fixed but keeps on changing in every performance. So I often wonder, shouldn't we rather start by questioning our narrow notions of literature rather than debating canons? How can we seriously include the great also tradition of trickster tales in Africa, Islamic Sufi poetry, but also spoken word performances and hip-hop in our consideration of African literature? But even of literature universally, I think this applies very much to the whole field of literary studies. How can we also teach across the boundary of languages? This is, of course, a matter of translation. We need more translations. But even French, English, and Portuguese literature from Africa and the diaspora, where translations exist, are often not taught together. The national philologies born out of the nation-state ideology and then also exported to Africa, they prevail. So Francophone literature is taught in departments of French and Anglophone literature in departments of English, and African language literature, well, either it's me teaching them or they fall in between all cracks. I'm of course being ironic because teaching African language literatures of the whole continent is basically impossible and very telling as well of how we do not consider it actually enough. Chinese literature, there's always a department or a professor for it. Japanese literature, the same thing. But how can one person or even one department teach the literature of a whole continent? And often African language literature in another telling way has become also the appendix to linguistics or anthropology rather than literature. And even in universities on the African continent, so not only in Western contexts. So in short, actually, I wish, first of all, also the literary world would be more inclusive, both if it comes to African literature, but as well as to literary studies more generally. And in such a more colorful world, such a world, I think, can also afford to include Shakespeare, who has inspired so many African writers.
In my thinking, I would replace Shakespeare with a writer like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, whose through his critical works, drama and fiction, attempts to link with the African post-colonial experience at the grassroots.
To begin with, Shakespeare never was part of the curriculum while I attended school. We read writers such as John Steinbeck, Arthur Miller, and more modern ones, Dylan Thomas also, but never really Shakespeare. I only became acquainted with Shakespeare and then mainly his poems, his sonnets, when I was already studying at the university. And I think I became interested in Shakespeare mainly through Stephen Greenblatt's work, who wrote a lot about Shakespeare. And then it was not so much about catching up with the canon, but rather developing a very deep interest in early modern Europe. This is what brings me a bit closer to Shakespeare. But now I have to replace him, which has nothing to do with my canon of literature. But I know whom I replace him with, namely Fela Kuti. Fela Kuti's lyrics are absolutely stunning. He has written about topics that I think were very close to Shakespeare. And that's why Fela Kuti's lyrics still are able to speak to us today. And he has left such an imprint in not only Nigeria's, but I think Africa's intellectual life. Fela Kuti wrote about social processes, political processes, very, very critically, about history, identity concepts, and so on. And his music and absolutely stunning performances are of a complexity and depth that I think are really unmatched. So Fela Kuti, being such an influential artist and intellectual of the 20th century, is my replacement for Shakespeare, whereby I think replacement is not the right word. So Fela Kuti is whom I suggest we should listen more to and appreciate more after I think he gets a little bit forgotten, which is not right.
If I am to replace William Shakespeare in world literature today, I think no doubt I'll go for Wole Soyinka. This is because Wole Soyinka's name is a household name not only in Africa but around the world. He is a household name because he has been able to give, through his literature, a hybrid output of indigenous African culture with a foreign culture in his writing. More often than not, we find him presenting indigenous African problems through a hybridization of African culture and a Western culture. And he does this perfectly well through characterization and thematic preoccupation. Another reason is that his command of the English language is top-notch. Though not a native speaker, He uses it so well in his choice of diction in his poetry and also in his play. And also, Wole Soyinka was awarded the 1986 Nobel Prize in Literature, being the first sub-Saharan Africa to be honored in that category. Little wonder, the playwright Osofisan writes that Wole Soyinka is today the greatest living African dramatist.
To choose only one African playwright or author to replace Shakespeare in school curricula would be a difficult decision to make. I would, of course, be tempted to consider authors like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, or Wole Soyinka, owing to the role these authors have played in shaping African literature. Chimamanda Ngozi and Yvonne Awor also come to mind. However, this would be a self-defeating act, that is, dismantling a canon only to replace it with another. Such a decision also risks amplifying the tension between Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone African literatures, and may even allow Anglophone writing to further dominate the field. To counter this, I would perhaps settle for an author who writes in an African language, Kiswahili for example, and this would leave me with a large pool of writers to choose from, like Ibrahim Hussein, Shaban Robert, Euphrates Kezilahabi, Kithaka Maberia, Ken Walibora, and many others. After all, written Swahili literature existed almost 400 years before Chinua Achebe, the so-called father of African literature, published his first novel in 1958. Yet, my most preferred replacement for Shakespeare would be someone who archives and disseminates oral art forms because, in the African context in particular, oral forms of expression and the indigenous knowledges they carry often get sidelined in favor of written forms of expression. I would, therefore, select an oral historian like Mzee Suleiman Ali Nyembwe from the Kenyan coast, or Haji Gora Haju, the Zanzibari oral poet, or one of the many West African griots. I would choose oral literature to fill the enviable space previously occupied by Shakespeare.
To me, it's way beyond just filling the void. It's more about a symbolic battle on occupying a well-deserved space. If I were to summarize his career in one word, it would be the Swahili pun, utandawazi, utandawizi. Globalization has opposed to global theft. He's been a rightivist throughout, a writer-activist, ensuring that Africans do not mainly continue enriching the, in bracket, Western world further through work of imagination in languages which in the first place dismembered us. In my eyes, he succeeded in combining in a unique way fiction, faction, action, and philosophy, and the struggle for the emancipation of the intellect. The 2000 languages, the 1001 faces of African societies, and the imaginaries in and of Africa, while always securing the base, to use a part of one of his essays title. Whether in groundbreaking essays such as Decolonizing the Mind, the Politics of Language in African Literature, or Remembering Africa, in his numerous plays, short stories, novels, and children books, our Mzee, our man of great wisdom, wizard of the African literary scene, is without any doubt my number one. When we last met in June 2018 at the reading in Cologne, Germany, he reminded me of one thing I still owe him, a book in an African language. When we first met in August 2009 at the University of Dar es Salaam, he, as everyone knows him, took the time to speak to the base, the younger generation of people of African descent, to which he has always had this message: we should achieve three things in life. 1. To learn to read and write in an African language. 2. To read a whole book in an African language. And 3. Most importantly, to write a whole book in an African language. He's done his part as a true river between the worlds, to use again a title of one of his novels. It's high time he received the long-deserved award, and it's high time we had all his books in school curricula worldwide. Only so can we weep not our cultural heritage.